sure. Alrighty, so hi everyone. Welcome to the React 2 lecture. And for those of you who might notice, right now I'm facing this way. That's because I'm using my monitor right now for this course, and my laptop is like right here. So even though I'm looking like into this way, I'm actually like looking at my monitor, just so that you all know. And yeah, let's get started. And before we get into this, I just want to quickly recap kind of like the announcement that I made on Monday. So essentially the changes to the general course schedule is that we are no longer going to do kind of like a branch split early on. And essentially all of you all will be learning about React, Express, MongoDB. And after you go through all these lessons, you will then be able to choose an emphasis. So emphasis, it will either be a front emphasis or a backend emphasis. And the emphasis will last around like a week or so. So essentially like 2 or 3 lectures. And it will like go much deeper into the corresponding emphasis that you have chosen. And kind of like the motivation behind this structural change is we really do want to provide you with a very like holistic full stack education experience instead of like only learning one track and then learn the primers. And yeah, so this is one of the main motivation. The other motivation is that people kind of like generally inclined to do the backend track for some reason. So we have like kind of like more people want to do the backend track, and this is not really balanced for the course. So that's why we decided to change everything up. But yeah, and so that's about the course structure. And until October, not on, like until October the 26th, you will all be inside like one full stack kind of like track. On October 26th, you can sense like one of the emphases. And this is how our course structure will work. Any questions so far? Any questions so far about the course structure? All right, if not, just a friendly reminder, the project to calculator is already released. We have also remember, please download the skeleton code. We have included quite a lot of skeleton code for the project to make it easier. And it's a pretty fun project. You got to build a full-fledged calculator in the browser, kind of like mimicking the iOS calculator style. So that's about that. And we will be releasing another homework. It's a React homework at the end of the day or at the end of the lecture. And it will be due sometimes next week. So yeah. Cool. Now let's get into it. Before we dive right in, let's do a quick recap. So from the last lecture, you learned how to set up a React development environment. Also learn about how to mess around with create React app. Essentially, when you want to start a React app, create React app is definitely your best choices. And you also understand how the sausage is made for some reason. And now for React 2 lecture. The agenda for today is that you will learn how to, this is kind of like all the meat about React. You'll be learning how to do props, how also why are props not enough. You'll also be learning how to do state. So state and prop are kind of like 2 ways that React handle data inside the React app. We'll also be talking about how to lifting state up, essentially how to manage state in a parent container. And then we'll talk about conditional rendering. And if we have time, we'll also talk about some helper functions. And now, this lecture will be mainly code demo. Essentially, what this means is that I will open up a VS Code, and on one side of the screen, on the other side, it'll be kind of like a browser. I will code live during the lecture. And so if you want to follow along, please go to this link. And this link should link to one folder inside the GitHub repo. It's the full stack decal repo. If you already clone it, it should be fine. But if you haven't, and if you want, go ahead and clone it. And we'll be developing inside the lecture/React2 folder. Oh yeah, could you put the link in the chat, of course. You can also find the, oops. I probably need to, okay. You can also find the link inside the lesson plan. But I will post the link again here. Oh, I missed an H. That's funny. Okay, yes, this should be the correct link. Okay, cool. Now let's get into it. Actually, before we get right in, any questions so far about any logistics, stuff like that? I know a few people just joined. All right, cool. If not, let's get into it. So, 1 second. Okay. And so this is the thing that we are going to build. And it's a tic-tac-toe app. As you can see, this is a tic-tac-toe app. And here, there's a next player. So essentially, like, if the next player is X and you click it, it'll be X. Next player O, it'll be O. And just like all the tic-tac-toe app, tic-tac-toe game, once a player kind of like do a connect 3, they win. So this is the thing that we are going to do this lecture. And we are going to follow the, why this is, okay. So we are going to follow this lesson plan here. I'm also going to share in the chat, copy link. All right. So once you have cloned all the code inside the repo, and if you take a look at the React folder, there will be 3 components that you can see. First is called square. So it's like here. The other is called board. And finally, we have game. Okay. Actually, before we get started, let me close the app. So essentially, this is the thing that's like after this lecture, this will be the tic-tac-toe app. However, right now, let's start with a blank slate. So I've already cloned the code here. Let me do npm run start. Oops, sorry, I forgot to install. Alrighty. While it installs, let's take a look at the code. So right now we have 3 React components: game, board, and square. So game is kind of like the main function, essentially the entry point to the index.js file. And as you can see, the game contains everything that we want the React to be rendering. So essentially it contains a board. It also contains some game info, which we'll be filling out later. And inside, if you remember from the first lecture, this is kind of like how we will call a React component. And if you look at this, this is a board component. If we go to the board component, as you can see, there's a function called render square, and it returns essentially nice square from 0 to 8. Okay, and also the nice square. The nice squares are contained in 3 rows. So essentially each row contains 3 square function, 3 render square function, and each render square, they just simply return a square. This might sound a little bit weird. Why don't we just use square? I'll explain this in a minute. And we also have the square component. As you can see, the square component is simply a button. So yeah. Now we have already installed. everything, and let's do npm run start. So after we call npm run start, it will start up the development server, and then it will give us the tic-tac-toe app. And if you click on any of the square right now, it doesn't show up anything. And this is because we haven't implemented anything. So this is kind of like the blank slate that we are going to start with. And now, before we implement a tic-tac-toe app, actually let's implement something much simpler. So say we just want to display a number in each of the squares. Okay. So how we are going to do this? This is where we are going to talk about props. So prop is a very, very important part of the React library. You can think of prop as kind of like a dictionary that each React component maintains to look up some values associated with it. So if you look at this particular function in the Notion page, you might notice there's a value equals I here. And essentially, it's saying that when we call the render square function, the render square takes in a value, a variable I. And then the variable I would be assigned as a value to the square component. Okay, and this value will become part of the props. And so how will we use these props? And what's the use of the prop? The use of prop is to allow us to pass data from parent component to its child component. So if we look at the board component here, right now it's simply calling a square component. It's not passing down any data. However, if we do like value equals I here, this way we can pass down this I into the square component. So when we are calling render square, all these render square functions, it will pass on different data into this into the square component. There's some question in chat. So what's props short for? I think props is short for properties, but I think I need to double check. So yeah, this is how we are going to pass on data from parent container to the child container. It's by using a name and value pair. And notice that if you want to include any JavaScript inside, so any like React JSX inside the value thing, you need to use a curly bracket. Okay, if you don't do the curly bracket, as you can see, it will shows up. It shows an error. It will say the curly bracket is expected. So this is how the React syntax work. Okay, so now we know how to pass on props from the parent container to the child component. Then how the child component will use props. And this is how we are going to use props. First of all, we assign props inside the parameter of the square function. And then after we assign props as a parameter, we can then access all the properties that the parent container is passing down to the child container by using props dot the property name. So in our case, we have passed down a value called value. And to access this value, we just call props dot value. And also, you do need to include a curly bracket around the props dot value as well. So now let's try that. So props. And also, just as a side note, you don't really need to call it props. This is just like a kind of like a standard thing to do. If you call it some other name, for instance, like P, it will still work. But it's nice to follow the standards. So let's call it props. And to access this value that we are parsing in right now, we do props.value. All right, now let's take a look. And I just hit refresh. And as you can see, right now, all the values are being populated into the square. Can you all see this clearly? Let me just make it a little bit larger. Okay, cool. And so all those values are passed on from all this function call. So as you can see, for instance, render square 0. If we look at this function call, render square 0, it calls this function. It will return a child component called square, value equals 0, because this is how we pass on the 0. And then the 0 pass on here as a value. As a result, it becomes the content of this button. Okay, someone asked, what's the parent component of square? Okay, very good question. So if you look at the square function, it's being called inside this function. And so essentially this function right here is kind of like where we have called it. And this function is inside the board component. So essentially board component is the parent component of the square component. Any other questions, concerns? Is this clear to everyone?
Yeah, I had a really quick question, kind of similar to this. So we're calling square inside board, but since square is also a function, like why does it have like almost like the HTML tags in it? Like, I guess like why don't we just call it as we're kind of calling as we normally call functions, I guess?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So essentially so this is kind of like a React convention. When the function is capitalized, like the first letter is capitalized, the React will treat it as a component. And to call it component, you need to like do it this way. So kind of like how you call the board here. And when it's just a normal function, for instance, a render square here, as you can see, the first letter is not like capitalized. And as a result, you don't really need to, so this is just kind of like a normal function instead of a component, and you can't call it that way. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so if we could also like define square as like a normal function and call it that way inside a function, or would that like would we have to define it as a component to like call it inside a function?
Yeah, so this is more kind of like a personal preference, but I would say the industry standard is that if it's something that's kind of like individual, if it's something that's like can stand on its own and can act kind of like as a component, we'll just make it a React component. Usually the function is something that does some side effect, if that makes sense.
Okay. So wait, so we could also make render square a component then?
Yes, we can make render square component. I mean, usually, to be honest, this is not the best way to do this. We can actually, usually we'll do it this way actually, instead of like doing the render square, we'll just do like square, and this will be 0. Then 1, and then 1, 2, 3. I would say this is kind of like the, yeah, this is kind of like the usual way that we'll do it.
Okay.
But for the demonstration purpose, we're using a render square.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions, concerns? All right. Now let's move on to the next step. Oh, also, I want to emphasize that props are immutable. So essentially, when after the prop is passed down to the child component, if you want to change it inside the child component, you cannot do that. So essentially, you cannot do something like props.value equal to 1. This is like not recommended. I don't know whether React will catch that actually. Let's see. Oh yeah, React well catch that. It says cannot assign to read-only property value. So essentially, the other props, they are immutable. All right. Now, all right. Now we have all the 9 numbers in place. Let's try to do something fun with them. So let's say we want the button to actually do something. And if since we're using React, React is essentially writing JavaScript. So if you want this to like trigger, for instance, an onClick function, it's very, very similar to how we would do it in like vanilla JavaScript. As you can see, this button class name equals square onClick equals alert. This is kind of like the usual way that we'll do it. However, if we look at the kind of like the more React-ish approach, we do it this way. So essentially, we do it using a lambda function, and then this lambda function, it returns a function. And why do we do this instead of just doing alert click? So this is because that when the button is being evaluated inside React, if it's directly alert click, it will simply call this function. And this will just like when it's being rendered, it will directly being like the alert will directly pop up. So we don't want that to be happening. So we kind of like want to have a buffer before the function. So as a result, we do a lambda function. We let the lambda function return a function that causes alert. And to put it simply, every time we want to kind of like add a function to any properties in the React tag, you need to do it this way. You need to return kind of like a lambda function returning a function. So this is very similar to a high order function in the from the homework that you were doing, the JavaScript homework. And now let's try to kind of like console.log all the props.value. So let's do this. So let's do onClick equals, and remember we need to make it a high order function because otherwise it will just be executed when it's being rendered. And now let's open up the console. Let's see. So when we click 2, as you can see, it displays 2 onto the screen. If we click 6, it displays 6. If we click 8, it displays 8. Any questions so far?
Kind of just making sure we wanted the lambda function because we wanted a buffer between like clicking it and it actually doing something, right?
So essentially, so React, I do agree. So React, like this side of React is kind of weird. Essentially what happens under the hood is that when the React is trying to render this button, it will actually evaluate this first. And the result, if we simply do like console.log here, if we do this, let's see. As you can see, like if we do this, it will just print out all the numbers directly. This is because when the square component is being rendered, it will evaluate this. And the result of evaluating this function is simply printing it out instead of like treating it as a function. So we want the result of evaluating the thing inside onClick to be a function. And if we hit refresh, as you can see, right now it doesn't just directly print out all the values. It prints out the values only when we click on it.
Right. Okay.
Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So essentially, if we directly do console.log, and so as you can see, it logs all the values. And when you click on the button, it doesn't log anything anymore. This is because the onClick right now, it's kind of like this. It will just be like 0. This is what it is not. It's not necessarily that. It's whatever like the strange thing that's being returned after console.log, but it's essentially something like this instead of kind of like a logging function. Do we have any other questions, concerns? All right, now let's move on and talk about state. So right now we know how we can pass down a number or a value from a parent component to a children component. However, for the tic-tac-toe game to work, we do need to store the value somewhere, and the user will also kind of like have a way to input all those values. And if we simply kind of like store the user input somewhere here, this doesn't really make sense because like we cannot really change it because like it's hard coded. So we do need to figure out some way for us to keep track of all the values inside all the rendered square or inside all the square component. Now let's talk about state. So if we look at this function right here, this is kind of like the version where the state is being introduced. Okay. Oops. Let's actually copy this one. Sorry about that. I think there's some bug here. Like I missed a few brackets here for this function. But yeah, if you are following along, please copy this. This will make a little bit more sense. But essentially how the state will work. So this is how we'll use state. We call something called useState, and this is something called a hook. First of all, to use the useState hook, we need to import it from the React library. And useState is essentially saying that you will return two values. And the first value is kind of like a variable. So essentially the state itself. And the second value that is returning the function to change the state. So the React, after we call useState, it will provide us with a state and also a handler to change the value of the state. And this way we can keep track of all the values inside the square component. And if we look at the set value function here, so this handler here is actually a function. And how we're going to use this function is simply called set value, followed by the value that we want to set it in. And if we look at this, if we look at the tic-tac-toe game, let's just say right now we start with kind of like an empty board. And then once the user clicks it, it will set a value of X inside one of the buttons. Okay. So this is right now the square function. Let's hit refresh. Okay. We do have all the prop style values here. And this is because within the useState call, we also include prop style value here. So anything that's included inside useState will be the initial value of the state. And if we click on one of the square, as you can see, it sets a value to X. And that is because there's an onClick function here. And when we click on it, it calls a set value function. The set value function has a value of X, and then it sets it to X. And if we change it to O, and hit refresh, as you can see, when we click on one of the square, it becomes O. Change it back. And just like I said, the initial value comes from the prop cell value here, passed down. So this is kind of like a brief introduction of the state. Do we have any questions so far? There's something in chat. For line 10, why is it value and not prop cell value? Oh yeah, okay. So, so the question is asking here, why is it value not prop cell value? This is because we're using the state variable here. So essentially, after we call use state, instead of using the props, we're using the state variable. This is because if we're using prop cell value, we cannot really change it because the properties, they are immutable. So we do need to, if we want to support kind of like the user click on one of the square and change it to X, we do need to use state for that. And to use state, we're doing the use state, we call the use state function, and it returns two things. The first is a state variable, it's called value. And as a result, we use the state variable here. We can also change it to like something else, some other name, for instance, like state value. I think this may make a little bit more sense. Oops. That's state value. I'll just change the name of the function. So essentially right now, we're using the state value instead of the props value. Someone may ask, so what if we're using the state value, then how come we have access to all the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8? Isn't that from props? And yes, the answer is yes, it does come from props. However, we make the props of value kind of like as an initial state by using the useState function followed by the props of value. This will provide the initial value as the props of value to the state value. Just as a side note to the state variables, the state variables will keep track of all the values, and unless we hit refresh. So if we hit refresh, as you can see, all the values becomes back to its original initial value.
Kind of just making sure that this all like makes sense.
Yeah.
So like at first we're in board, right? And like function board. And so that will call when we click on something that calls render square, which ends up calling square. And then in square, we're actually like setting the value by calling user state, which also keeps track of like 0, 1, 2, 3. And then that all using use state value will become our X, right?
Yes. So yeah, I can just like quickly recap, kind of like the procedure. So right now, first of all, we have everything inside the board, and the board they call the render square function. And let's say we pass on 0, okay? And then this will return something like square value equals 0.
Right.
And inside the square values equals to 0. So inside square, we have something like state value, and the initial value is 0 because we assign it here. You say props of value, it will essentially inject the props of value as a state value.
And the props value is 0, right?
Yes. And once the user click and the onClick function get triggered, we will call the set state value x. And this one makes our state value become x. And this is how kind of like the overall procedure works.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other questions? This is clear to everyone? All right. So now we have a way to keep track of all the acts here. However, I feel like this is not really that ideal. This is because we do need to check for a winner when we are doing the tic-tac-toe game. And if we look at how we are tracking the state right now, this is kind of hard to do because all the state for each individual square, they all live in its own component. So if you look at, for instance, render square 0, the 0 square, it lives in, like the state itself, it lives inside the square function. It's very hard to access like all the 9 square states at the same time. So how will we approach this problem? This is kind of like a design problem in terms of architecturing. And now let's introduce something called lifting the state up. So essentially, instead of storing the state inside each individual square component, we store the state of all 9 squares inside the board component. Okay. And our way to represent it will be using an array. So this is how we're going to do this. So right now, instead of having a state inside the square function, we keep track of all the states of all 9 squares inside the board component. Okay, so let's get rid of this. Let's make it still props.value. Let's delete this. Okay. And so let's take a look at the useState function here. So right now, the useState, inside the useState is array 9.fill now. And this one, oops, and this one essentially creates an array fill with now. So this is something that I'll look at. Okay. What we are using now instead of numbers, because usually tic-tac-toe game, they do start with empty squares. All right. So now let's also change our render square function. So right now, instead of like doing all, instead of hard coding all this, we can do something a little bit smarter. So let's do this. Okay. And we have render square. Sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry about that, but I feel like this is kind of weird. Wait, why I feel like a part of my code just disappeared. There should be more to this. The heck? Okay, this is fine. So how we're going to, so right now we have all the states. And how we're going to render this is we're still going to use the render square function. However, instead of like just putting value as value I, we're doing squares I, okay? And yeah, so why do we do this? It's because, so if we look at the first square, instead of just passing down 0, we're going to use the 0 as the index to access the kind of like 0's position of the squares array. And this is because inside the 0's position of the squares array, it stores the value for that particular square. So you can think of the array as something like this. Oops. So right now, here's our array. No, 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 no. All right. So this is how our array looks like. And this array, though it's a one-dimensional array, we're representing all the 9 squares. And each like now represent a state, the state of 1 square. And so if we look, for instance, if we look at like the first square, it will be represented by the first now. If we look at the second square, it will be represented by the second now. And so say we want to update one of the square to have an X, we'll then update the array to be X. And this way we can keep track of all the state of each square. So let's change this black. Let's delete on click. Let's take a look at our React function. Okay, right now, so as you can see, instead of the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we have them all empty. And this is because our array is filled with now. We can fill with something else, for instance, 99. 99. And if we hit refresh, as you can see, all the squares now filled with 99. Essentially, this is saying that this squares array here is in charge of storing all the states here. Let's change it back to now, because this makes more sense. All right. Do we have any questions so far? Yeah, so I is the index to the squares array instead of kind of like being an actual value. Does this make sense so far? All right, so right now we have all the squares, the state of all the squares available. And let's try to do the HandleClick function. So essentially, if we look at the previous thing that we have coded, once we click on a function, once we click on one of the square, we set its state value to X. However, right now, how do we do this? Because the onClick function lives somewhere here inside the button. However, the state right now is here. This means that we cannot really like access the onClick function inside this to this. So how we're going to do this? We're going to do this by passing down a function as well alongside the value. Okay, so let's do that. So right now, instead of doing only a value square, we're going to include a bracket here. Let me just copy and paste it. This will be easier. This should actually be an arrow function. Let's change that. Okay. And so if we look at the render square function now, instead of only passing down a value, we also pass down an onClick function. Okay. We're going to work on the HandleClick function in a second. Right now it's not defined yet. But once we pass down the onClick function, we can call it here, similar to how we access the props.value. We can say props.onClick, call it this way. And so this way, when one of the square is clicked, it actually calls the HandleClick function inside this board component. And we will make sure that the HandleClick function will change one of the value inside the squares array. So let's do that right now. So let's define a HandleClick function. And the HandleClick function, it takes in also the index of the square. And first of all, we call square.slice. We make a copy of the square, and then we change it and we set it back. And this is because we cannot directly modify the state inside React. We do need to make it a copy and then use this particular function returned by the useState hook to update it this way. So right now, if we look at the function, if we click on one of the square, someone's unmuted. Someone trying to ask a question. All right, cool. So if we look at a square right now, if we click on one of the function, if we click on one of the square, it calls the HandleClick function. And the HandleClick function will actually update the square's copy inside the square variable. And inside the square variable, it will update the corresponding square according to the index.
My poor nail.
Sir, someone's not muted. I'll mute you. Sorry about that. Okay. And all right. Now, I think what will help the understanding is that I will kind of like do a run through of the procedure similar to this. So right now, we're doing something like, so first of all, we have the board component. And we are still calling the render square function. However, inside the render square function, the 0 is actually the array index. And this array index, it represents the state of one of the square. So say we are trying to click on the first or the 0 square, then it should be like this one. And this one, when we click on it, it will call when it's being rendered, it will call render square. And then the render square function will return the value equals squares at index I. And this is essentially saying that for this particular square, we'll get them the value inside the 0's position, inside the state variable of the board component. Okay. So essentially this returns this now. And inside and right now, our array, so before we click it, our squares kind of like look something kind of like this. Okay, so a bunch of them. And once we click the onClick function, so when we click onClick inside the square, as you can see, it will call props.onClick. And this props.onClick function is passed down here. So onClick, HandleClick, so onClick, props.onClick. And this is referring to the HandleClick function that we have. This is also 0, since the I is 0 when we are calling the first render square. And inside the HandleClick function, it's saying that the square's copy zero's square copy will be updated to x. So essentially, after we call this, we'll have something like this. So after we call HandleClick, it will first of all copy a, make squares a copy, and then it will make the first element x, and then it will assign back using the setSquares handler. And once it does that, and the React will do a render again, and this time, when they call render square, when something like this, the square will actually be this. So it will actually be square values equals squares 0, and this square 0 itself, this would now be x, if that makes sense. I think Cal, you raised your hand. What's your question?
Can I ask, if you want to update the squares array, why won't you, I guess, set it as a var, like var squares, instead of use a const and then having to use set squares to update it?
Oh yeah, so this is kind of like the convention of React. Essentially, inside React, you can, especially for state, you can only use the function here to update its state variable. So you, like, if you do something along the lines of this, squares, squares I equals x. This is like not really recommended by React. However, if you refresh, you won't actually like, you won't actually have an error. But this is simply just not recommended, because in some cases it will trigger some very strange rendering issue. The safest bet would just be to make a copy of the state function and update the copy first, and then assign the copy back to the squares variable by using the setSquares function. Does this make sense at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other question?
Quick question. When we go into render square and we have square value is equal to squares of I in like the brackets, how does it know to like go into board? And I guess like that's where like the state is. Like how does React kind of know that, or how does the computer know that?
Oh, all right. So how it knows that is because we have passes in. I think so you're asking like how the square component knows which kind of like which array value are we using? Are you asking this?
Yeah, or like how does it kind of know that like it eventually gets like it's all in the board function? I guess that's what I'm asking. That like the array is made there, or like that's where it's getting its value from.
I see. Okay. So how React work is that once the state, so when we are returning something, it will always look at the component state. So if the state is like refreshed, and then we will the React will do a re-render. And when it's doing a re-render, these squares, all the value is being passing through the value equals square I, and this squares, it corresponds to the squares here. So essentially, if you the two variable name, they do need to match. If you change the squares to like another name, for instance, like square board, this will actually have like a undefined issue. And so how does the square component knows the value is coming from this square? It's essentially in this line. So value equals squares I.
So the green square, like that green square is like matching with the square function that's above the board, and like squares of I, like that squares is matching inside the board function, right?
Yeah, so this square is essentially the component here. It's referring to this.
Right.
And this squares, sorry about naming. I should probably call this like square state. This will probably make a little bit more sense. Now that I think about it. And oops. Okay, yeah, this will make a little bit more sense. So this squares is used to keep track of all the state, essentially an array. And this square is the React component itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very good question. Any other questions? All right, now let's move on. So right now we have handled one player, and we cannot really play tic-tac-toe on our own. So we do need to handle the other player as well. This means that we do need to render a circle. After we render a square at first, the next one should be a circle. And then the next one will be not a square, but a cross. So when we render a cross first, the next one is a circle, then the next one should again be a cross. The two variables, the two values, they should be alternating. And how we're going to do that is by using something called conditional rendering. And so first of all, we need to think about how we will keep track of this, keep track of the player essentially. And we'll also be using a state. So let's create another state. Just copy and paste it from here. And this state will be called axis playing, and the function is the set function. It will be called set axis playing, and it will start with a true variable, a true value, and once the circle is playing, then it will become a false. Okay, so by setting the U state to be true, the X will be true at first. So how do we handle the logic? The logic should actually happen inside the HandleClick function, because this is where essentially the click action happens. And what we need to do for each click is that instead of directly assigning an X, we need to conditionally render either an X or an O based on the value here. So we're going to use something called the ternary operator. It's essentially a question mark followed by a semicolon. And X is playing, this will count. So this is very similar to if statement. So this is essentially saying if X is playing, then we'll render. So if X is playing, the squares copy I will be equal to X, and otherwise it will be equal to O. And the ternary operator is just kind of like a shorthanded way of writing this if statement. So if this is true, it will go to X. Otherwise, it will go to O. And so after we set it either to X and O, we also need to change the variable, change the state itself. So let's use the set axis playing, and we'll use the Boolean negation logic. So this exclamation mark is saying that if this is true, it will change it to false, and vice versa. If this is false, it will change it to true. And this way we can alternate between the two people. And to make things a little bit clearer, let's also change the status as well. So right now the status is like this line, next player X. Let's also try to change this. So instead of constantly displaying next player is X, we see what we first of all have a string of next player, and then depends on the X is playing variable, we change it either to X or to O. Okay. Now let's hit refresh. Oops. Wait, why is this happening? Maybe I need this actually. Okay. Let me add a bracket in. Okay. So right now, let's see. If we click on the first square, it will becomes X. And then the next player will becomes O. X. And then it shows up the next player X. And then if they do here, the next player becomes O. And yeah. So right now we have almost everything in place. We just need to figure out how can we kind of like distinguish which player wins at the end. And before we move on to that, do we have any questions so far?
Can I have a question here?
Yeah.
So when you said that React would like re-render everything when we change a state, do you mean the React will re-render the board every time we change or like I guess is React like re-rendering all the components which have a state, I guess.
Is this yeah, this is yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just because I saw the status variable on line 24. This line is getting updated. So I guess like every time it renders, it reads again line 24 and try to like every time the status is reflected on the page. Yeah, I guess just yeah.
Yeah, so this is a very good question. Essentially, React will re-render every time one of these state variables change. So for instance, if something inside the square state changes, it will re-render. And something inside the X is playing. So if X is playing, like the value changes, it will also re-render. And the very cool thing about React is that you will only render the thing that it needs to be re-rendering. So if we hit X here, as you can see, this will update and this will oops. If we click on here, as you can see, like only O updates. Like the next player, it doesn't like flash and then appears again. This is because React has something called virtual DOM. The virtual DOM will it will first of all do a update on the virtual DOM, and then it compares compares the virtual DOM after the update with the real DOM, and it will see kind of like the differences between the virtual DOM and the real DOM, and then it will only do the updates on the real DOM when something changes. So essentially, if the next player, like all these characters, if they're not changed, React won't update them. It will only change the thing that it needs to be updated. So React is pretty smart about that. And this is why people always love to use React. It's pretty efficient at making updates. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does a lot. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Do we have any other questions, concerns? I do realize there's a bug here. So like if we keep click on one of the square, it's allowing the square to change. Let's just ignore this for now. I didn't take that into consideration. All right, now let's move on to the final part, the helper logics, the helper functions for logic. So we do need to have a function to see how we can calculate the winner. And to do this, you don't really need to understand kind of like the nitty-gritty behind all of this, because this is kind of like algorithm related. But essentially what we are doing here is so first of all, if we look at the square board right now, we have to have kind of like a connect, for instance, connect 3. There are multiple ways to do it. For instance, you can do it like diagonally, you can do it horizontally, and you can do it vertically. And here, all the lines here, for instance, 0, 1, 2, this is just in like this line. So this is like 0, 1, and 2. This line, if this is like one of the line, when all of it becomes the same, then a player will win. And all the lines here are essentially kind of like all the winning conditions that a player can have. And how we are going to calculate whether someone wins or not is by iterating through all the lines option. And if one of the line have all the same variable, so either same x, either they are all x, or either they're all o, and if they're all the same, then it means one of the player it wins. Okay, so for instance, if 0, 3, 6, they're all x's, so they're all like x, x, and x. When we are doing an iteration, so this for loop, the first for loop is iterating through each lines. And then we take out the variable, so A, B, C, lines I, it's essentially saying that A will be the first variable, B will be the second variable, C will be the third variable. And when we reach, so essentially, this one looks something like this. So for instance, it might be an O here, and maybe there are like 2 O here. I don't know. I'm just making things up. But when the for loop is like going through all these lines, for instance, if it goes through the second line here, it will look at like, so A will be O, B will be X, C will be another O. And this if statement is saying that if the first one is equal to the second one and the third one, then it returns itself. However, for the second line, it is not the case, because O is not equal to X. And if we look at the third line here, X is not equal to O. However, if we look at the fourth line, the first one is equal to the second one, and the first one is equal to the third one. As a result, we return here, we'll just return X as a result. Okay, and if none of the lines matches, if none of the lines have any matches, then we will return null. So this is how we are going to calculate it here. Let's copy and paste it here. And so for the winner, we do need to calculate it like every time that a player plays a move. As a result, we can simply include it here. And this is because every time the React component is being re-rendered, it will go through each and every of the function calls. Okay. And let's make sure. Oh, we should probably include it here. And let's also update the status. So right now the status is only saying the next, which one is the next player. Let's also include a player. Let's actually also include a winner. we do need to change it to a let statement, because if there is one winner, we do need to change the status to be kind of like winner is someone. And now let's see. Square is not defined. We probably, yeah, we change this name, square state. Cannot ops into copy and paste it here. Yeah, because we do need to access a function. We do need to define a function before I access it. All right. So now let's see. So once all the 3x connects in a line, it will say winner is x. And this is kind of like the function of calculate winner. Essentially, in our cases, this is kind of like the second vertical line. And this should be 1, 4, and 7, because it's like 0, 1. Like this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 1, 4, 7. These 3 are all the same, and as a result, it returns x. And since it returns x, the winner here, this one becomes x. And since there's a winner here, it's not now. So if winner, the status becomes winner is x. Do we have any questions? Is this clear to everyone? All right. And last but not least, we need to make sure that once the game is done, clicking the board doesn't do anything. So let's add this thing. Let's add this inside the HandleClick function. And what this is doing, square state. Okay, so what this is doing is that it's saying if the calculate winner, it returns something. Or the square state have something, it will directly returns. Wait, hang on, hold on. Square state. This is kind of weird. I don't think we need that, to be honest. But yeah, let's see. So once we have a winner, if we click on the square, as you can see, the board will not update it at all. This is because once we have a winner, we'll directly return. And the HandleClick function will not execute all the calls later. I don't know why I've included it here. I'll just delete it. It's pretty weird. Okay. Do we have any questions about the things that we covered today? Is that so the square don't change if you re-click one? Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks a lot. So someone cached kind of like the functionality of that. Thanks a lot, Andy. So yeah, this is meant to be so that when we click on, when one of the square state is already occupied with a value, if we click on it again, and if it detects any value inside, it will directly return. Yeah, thanks a lot. So we can try this out. So next player is O. if we click on X, as you can see, it doesn't do anything because it won't update since it detects square state have something and it has an early return. Okay. Cool. Do we have anything else? Do we have any questions, concerns? Yeah, before we let you all go, let me send the attendance form. All right. Yeah, while you're filling out the attendance form, let us know if you have any questions, concerns.
I have a question about project 2.